In December 2019, we began a monumental task, one that had not been undertaken for over 70 years, standing up a new military service. Our Guardians have done a lot already in nearly 4 years, and 2023 was a banner year for many of these efforts. But we're not done yet. We have more units being activated, more missions coming online, more personnel interested in being part of the Space Force than ever before. We have the most talented workforce, the most technologically advanced and innovative service on the face of the earth. And we are going to continue to forge a purpose-built Space Force, laser-focused on securing our nation's interests in, from, and to space. So get ready.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Space Force Association's Space Warfighter Talk series. I'm Greg Ellinger, and today I have the pleasure of talking with Kristen Burke, who is the China space expert at the China Aerospace Studies Institute, which we'll be calling CASI from here on out. Kristen is an accomplished researcher and recently published an unclassified report on the People's Liberation Army, Chinese People's Liberation Army, or PLA, command and control of their counter-space weapons, which I highly recommend everyone take a look at. This is far from her first work, and I suspect we're just getting started. Kristen, thanks for joining me today. And before we get started, I just want to have a quick note that the views and opinions expressed here today are not representative of the Department of Defense or the Department of the Air Force. Kristen, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to the Space Force Association for hosting these talks. I've listened to most of them, and so it's a really great resource to be able to share with the community. And thank you, Greg, for flagging the Counterspace report. I hope that all the Guardians get a chance to look at it, because up to now, it's the only unclassified report focused specifically on PLA counterspace command and control that was written with the warfighter in mind. And so I really look forward to getting your feedback on the report.
No, it's a fantastic report. I've spent some quality time with it as well, and it's amazing the things that you were able to find. So again, highly recommended reading. With that, tell us a little bit about your background. How did you build your qualifications? I think you're a Chinese speaker. How did all that come about? And how does this help you tackle some of the subject matter that we're going to discuss today?
Well, I am currently an open source researcher at CASI, where we work primarily with Mandarin language materials. Prior to that, I was a Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Space at ODNI, where I had the opportunity to lead large IC written products on space, as well as do large briefings on space. Prior to that, I was a China analyst at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, where you don't only get the opportunity to learn analytic tradecraft, but you also learn the interagency policymaking process. Those opportunities were ones that I wasn't specifically looking to be an intelligence analyst. I was looking to be a researcher, because I'm just a huge geek. And my undergraduate degree is in philosophy of science and math. And I got to the end of that degree and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And so I thought, well, I like problem solving. I like problem solving from different perspectives. So I'm going to learn a critical language. And I took every opportunity I could find to work and study overseas in China. And that's how I learned Mandarin. And then my graduate degree, my research focus was on China's national innovation system. And that's when I started to get interested in the space program, the role of the space program in China's thinking and innovation. And because I wanted to research that more, I found my way into the State Department. And so for any of the Guardians who might have similar types of interests, I would encourage everybody to just follow what you find interesting and what you're passionate about and what you would enjoy doing on a day-to-day basis. And for me, I'm a lifelong learner. I've recently gone back to school for a second bachelor's in engineering, and it just really improves the the type of analysis that I can do when you understand not just the cultural international aspects, but also the technical aspects as well. And the Guardians have the technical aspects. And so, working together, we can really do a good, picture in the unclassified space.
No, that's an amazing background. Thanks for getting into those details with us. And what a tremendous resource to have you at CASI, right? And I was wondering if you could take a little bit of time to kind of explain what CASI actually is. Is it a military organization? How does it work? Who do you work for? Simple. Where are you actually located, and how?
Yeah, I know, right? So the China Aerospace Studies Institute is an Air Force research and education organization under the LeMay Center for Doctrine Development and Education at Air University, which is at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. The current commander of the LeMay Center is Major General Wright. The CASI team has two offices. One is here in Alabama. The other is at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. We have a mission statement which includes 4 components, and in priority order, those are: first, conduct primary source research and written reports and briefings. Second, support the warfighter, which is usually in the form of participating in war games. The third component of our mission statement is to educate the force with the classes we teach at Air University and at the National Defense University. And I am trying to engage with the Space Security or the National Security Space Institute to see if there's something that we can do there as well. And then lastly, we do what we're doing right now, which is engage with the community. And that includes allies and partners. And in the past, when it's appropriate, we've also engaged with the PLA through what's called Track 2 diplomacy. A couple of the additional interesting things I'd flag about CASI is all the full-time civilian researchers had to pass a language exam in order to be hired at CASI. And so that can be a little bit intimidating, but what it means is we're all able to look at the information that's available and do our best to try to interpret it for the customers. And then last, we have this website where you can find everything we've researched, everything we've written, and all the translations that we've done.
And so I've got it on the screen here, just sharing kind of the screenshot of what that webpage looks like. And by clicking there, you see the large arrow. That's actually not part of the website. We added that. So that's how you can find some of Kristen's work under the Research Areas tab.
Yes, thanks, Greg. Under the Research Areas tab, you'll see that we do not just space, but focus on what is the PLA doing with the Air Force? What is the PLA doing with its rocket force? We also have a tab on the industrial base. And so if you want to go directly to all the things we've written on space, you click on that tab and then you click space, and then everything you see will be related to that topic.
Fantastic. Thank you. So again, I'm super excited to talk to you today. As somebody that does a bit of open source research and is really passionate about the topic of learning as much as we can on what China is doing in space and how it's going to enable their other forces, to talk to someone with your background is an amazing opportunity for me. One of the things, you mentioned with your background, one of the constraints that we deal with a lot of times is the amount of classified information that's out there and finding value in unclassified research. What kind of values have you found on the unclassified side, and how should those be best incorporated into our overall understanding of where China is heading with its space program?
No, I'm really glad you asked this question. Just a caveat, since I left the intelligence community to work with publicly available information, you might think that my view is biased, but my opinion is that, both types of information are extremely valuable, and you have to have both. You can't have one or the other. And so just a couple of points. Generally speaking, an all-source intelligence analysis uses just that, right? It's all the sources. and that includes unclassified information. Typically, unclassified information is pretty good at capturing trends over time. And if you are an intelligence analyst and you're writing for the president, the National Security Council, or even the Secretary of Defense, you are an all-source intelligence analyst. You don't brief the highest levels of government with a single int. That's just, they need to know a more complete picture. And so those people are usually looking at all sources, like I said. And those leaders are smart consumers of intelligence. They know, as well as we know, that it's never a smoking gun. And so one of the major values of unclassified information is that it can be discussed, analyzed, frequently updated, and all with a diverse audience. And it's the diversity of opinions and sources paired with something like a structured analytic technique that can really go a long way towards describing, reality. And speaking in the space sector specifically, unclassified information is particularly important because so much of what used to be secret is now viewable by anybody with a telescope. And that's a benefit when you're researching the space sector, because if you care enough to get the technical background, you can know a lot about space at an unclassified level. So that's one of the reasons I look up to you, Greg, because you have that and you're doing it. And I think that that's super commendable. And it's one of the reasons I've gone back to school for an engineering degree. I want to join the ranks of the backyard astronomers. And an important point to make is that, and Greg, you know this better than I do, we hear a lot about the overclassification of space, and there's this trend towards addressing that. And the thing that I'd flag from a China space perspective is that declassifying the threat is probably more of a deterrent than declassifying US capabilities. And specifically, our willingness to attribute bad behavior is one of the better deterrents to address Chinese space activity that the US thinks is alarming. And when we're talking about unclassified information on the Chinese space program, there's actually a lot of information available. And the reason for that is because they're really proud of it. They want us to know how well they're doing, and they want their domestic population to know what's going on as well. And so the English resources that they publish to let the international audience know, as well as the Mandarin language resources that they publish focusing on the domestic audience, there's a lot of information there. And the things they don't tell us directly about, such as, the specific capability on our favorite satellites, are still things that if you put in the time, you could, indirectly construct some of those capabilities by looking at what they tell us about, the optics and the things that are on their lunar rover, or, you can, if you're willing to put in the work, there's a way to get closer to knowing than you currently are.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the availability of where things are on orbit can also yield clues, which is no longer classified, as you mentioned, mm-hmm. Spacetrack.org and all of that being publicly available. Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Narrowing down our focus to, changing our focus, I should say, to the Chinese Communist Party and its space policy and objectives. You spend a lot of time dealing with these sorts of things. What are some of the common confusions you see that we, from a Western perspective, may have regarding China's space development?
Well, there are a lot, and I'm also get confused by these same things because I'm also a Western space, person. And so I'd say there are three typical causes of confusions. And again, Greg, if I make these same mistakes like 10 minutes from now, feel free to point them out, because you just need to be constantly kind of nudging each other to be better. And I really am into that. So the three types of things that cause confusions, I think, when Westerners are viewing the Chinese space program, the first one would be overemphasizing external drivers over internal drivers as the explanation for China's space program. And, an internal driver would be like a a political issue or a economic issue as a reason for doing something versus what a foreign country is doing. That would be an external driver.
Right.
And so many people talk about the international prestige, this term, was the reason why China started its space program. And that's the reason China launched its first satellite in the 1970s during the Cultural Revolution and during the Cold War. That's true. But it was really domestic drivers that led China's space program to take off. It was in 1992 that they announced their human spaceflight program, which was just a couple years after the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. And they needed to kind of take this weathered domestic audience and find something that they could all gather around and be inspired and excited about. And so a more recent example of where we sometimes overemphasize the external drivers over the internal drivers is there's a quote that we often hear. It's by a man in China called Ye Peijian. He was the Chang'e 1 chief engineer, and Chang'e 1 was the orbiter that went around the moon. He said something like, the moon is like the Diaoyu Islands, and if we don't go, we won't be able to. He said that in 2017, and we hear that quote a lot, and it's used to describe China's ambitions in cislunar space and having this sort of nationalistic, we need to occupy cislunar space or something. Right. And the domestic driver that's important to not overlook is a couple of points. One, it's like, well, who is Ye Peijian? He was, as I said, the chief engineer of Chang'e 1, and Chang'e 1 launched in 2007. So he's retired in 2017 when he says this. He's no longer acting in an official capacity. He was just the chief engineer of one program, not the whole lunar program. The second thing to note is he's answering a question by a domestic Chinese media reporter. And that reporter specifically asked, Mr. Ye, the lunar program is so expensive. Why are we going to the moon? And so he kind of, like many people, will often use a national security explanation to justify the cost of a program. And so just keeping that in mind when we look at that quote and we use it, it's just a more recent example than the 1992 human spaceflight program. So the second point that I think causes confusions is that we don't regularly read what's called a 5-year plan in China. And because the Chinese Communist Party controls the economy for the most part and the population, they have to do that by publishing plans, right? And the benefit of that is we get to read the plan too, because if they want people to implement the plan, they have to put it on the internet.
Right.
The second largest population in the world, which is news to me. I didn't realize India overtook China last year.
Right.
But anyways, and so reading what's in the 5-year plans helps us know what we should know. That helps us avoid surprise because they're quite transparent in some ways in those plans, telling us what their ambitions are, what their plans are, what the deadline is, what's the progress they made, what are the problems they're having, what did they look to, how are they going to resolve those problems? They say all of those things. And so it's really useful to read those. For example, there's 5-year plans and just additional government documents on a topic that we've all heard about, which is military-civilian fusion. And there's so much information on military-civilian fusion. I don't think all the commentators that talk about it have read all those documents. And that's unfortunate because there's so much that we can know about it by just reading what they publish for their own domestic population. Another thing that you can know about by reading the 5-year plans is more about on-orbit servicing. They write about that since 2016. And then lastly, the last thing that I think causes confusions for Western viewers of China's space program has to do with something, it's like a cross-cultural communication. It's gone out of vogue, the term cross-cultural communication, but it's still as present and problematic as it has ever been. And in particular, asymmetries in the way we view time. And if some people talk about this in terms of, different perspectives on the deterrence ladder, but I like to talk about it in terms of cross-cultural communication, because it takes deterrence out of the ivory tower and puts it in, an easier way for us to discuss, that we all have a perspective on communication and communicating with people who have different perspectives than we do. And so a way in which this plays out in misunderstanding, China's space program in particular has to do with, an example is, most people agree that that the PLA will not be tasked by the CCP to use a direct descent anti-satellite missile unless they think it's too late, unless they think they're about to really, really lose the strategic advantage, or, something disastrous happens.
Mm-hmm.
And we all agree with that because the PLA has been telling us since after their first ASAT test that the debris challenges them just as much as it challenges everybody else. That two, if they want to get any international support for their position in a battle with the United States, using a direct descent anti-satellite missile is not going to support them in achieving any support whatsoever. And they also just, realize that it's very, very risky. And if you can't be certain you're going to have your intended impact, not that the satellite it won't be hit, but the impact of what we will do in response to that, it's too much of an unknown. So most people agree that the PLA doesn't want to do that. But what we don't agree on has to do with the time, the way we interpret time. Is our version of too late the same as theirs? Is their, concept of last resort the same as ours? And those are the things that you can really only know through engagement with counterparts and talking about red lines.
Right. Thank you. I'd like to pull on a couple threads on some of the things you brought up there. You mentioned the military-civil fusion program in China. I think there's a tendency, and you alluded to this, that we assume that everything is being done in China's space is to the benefit of the People's Liberation Army, the PLA. Is that in fact the case, or what are you seeing in that realm?
Well, and lots of people have opinions about this, and so I'll just share mine with you. Like I said before, we know a lot about MCF because the Chinese have written about it in detail. They've written about it in detail.
For a while.
And from their perspective, it's not a secret. If you remember nothing else about MCF, I'm going to talk about it in depth, but if you remember nothing else, remember that it's a two-way exchange. From the very beginning to now, it's about a two-way exchange. It is not a one-way road where everything goes to the military. MCF supports national security, and that requires a strong military and a strong economy. And so that means that it is an oversimplification to assume that everything is controlled by the PLA. The party, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, they control everything, not the PLA. And the party's perennial struggle is balancing military and civilian goals and navigating the mixed incentives that they've set up in an effort to control the economy. So from a historical perspective, China's initial thinking on military-civilian fusion, which was called military-civilian integration at that time, was about strengthening the military by shrinking it. We're going to strengthen the military by making it smaller. And at that time in the 70s, the military was making everything for itself, down to broomsticks and saucepans. And there was just this difference in pricing and efficiency between what was going on the military side and the civilian side. And when Deng Xiaoping came in after the Cultural Revolution, his priority was to improve the Chinese economy. And he wanted to take the opportunity of not having any large international wars to worry about, to focus on the economy and make the PLA smaller so that it could be better versus trying to do everything.
Right.
And so MCF persisted from the 70s to today. And after current President Xi Jinping came to power, he answered one of the common complaints about MCF up to that time, which was insufficient central oversight. And so that's why we hear about MCF so much today, is because Xi Jinping, he elevated its importance. He said, well, I'm going to make a CCP committee dedicated to MCF to coordinate all the various aspects of MCF. And an important thing to know is that MCF is about much more than technology, right? The military used to make broomsticks and saucepans. So one of the things that's a big component of MCF is addressing the pricing mismatch in civilian components and military components. Another aspect of MCF is helping, retired military personnel integrate into a civilian society. Like, we can understand that.
Right.
Another aspect has to do with making sure that civilians have access to all the research institutes which have historically been PLA, owned and operated. And so while we hear the most about the technology aspect of MCF, it includes so much more. And that's why the Chinese don't think it's a secret. And that's what Xi Jinping did. He didn't downsize the goals of MCF. He just put more focus on trying to manage all of them versus letting the provinces and different people kind of just have a mismatch, once in a while implement, once in a while not. And so traditionally, the main way the military, but let's focus on the technology aspects because that's what really is of most interest to the US and in particular the space community. So the main ways the military is supposed to access civilian technology is through using defense procurement contracting channels, like a procurement network. And historically, the military didn't want technology from the civilian sector. They thought it's not secure and it's low quality. Like, I can make it better myself. But that's what, Deng Xiaoping and others were trying to limit. They didn't want the military to have so many factories doing it on its own. They wanted the civilians to take over more of the contracting production capabilities. And so that's not really the thing we're worried about, though. What we're worried about is this idea that there could be involuntary, there's the civilians that volunteer, to participate. They respond to an RFI through a procurement channel. There's that. Then what we're worried about are the people that are, scientists and researchers and companies that are maybe forced to share their data or whatever information that they know about their foreign partners with the PLA. That's what really bothers us. And that's a real thing. Around 2014 to the 2017 period, China's research and development sort of structure for managing R&D budgets and applications went under a big reform. And one of the many things that they did at that time was they established a database to enable the searching of government-funded research and technology outcomes. And the main purpose of the data sharing platform was to achieve efficiency in state R&D budgets across military and civilian goals. And that, it was about, efficiently using their R&D budget, but it also directly supports encouraging military and civilian research teams to work together, because if they can say on their application, hey, we're hitting these two goals, not just one, please give us national funding for our project, you're more likely to get funding. And if you are a civilian institution and you receive government funding and you didn't work with the military at all, you still have to put your research outcomes in this database so that other people who are going to apply for research funding or they want to build on your innovations, they can access that. So there's a summary of the research finding and then the POC. And so this means that if you are intentionally trying to not share anything with the PLA, but you take state funding, you don't really have a choice.
That could be a
But I
problem.
want to, but I want to cut out, it's not that cut and dry, because the PLA still has to take action on that information. They have to call up that person that's the POC, and that person has to respond. So there's still a lot of room for failure to follow up. And there's a lot of mixed incentives for helping the military, but at the same time be innovative. Those don't always work hand in hand. And so it's not as cut and dry. And recall what I said about MCF being a two-way street. You've probably heard less about what the military is supposed to do to make technology which is relevant to economic goals available for the civilians. And in that regard, they have declassified military patents to include those related to missiles and satellites. There was a fair tranche of those that were available in the 2018 and 2019 period. And they've also published their own type of technology procurement book, which civilians can use to inquire about military and technology. So the civilians have this database, they put their information in. So civilians and the military can look at that. But the military publish, and I've seen it, it's online, like a sort of like the yellow pages.
Right.
You're interested in this kind of technology, contact this person. And so they've done all those things, but it's hard to know. So it's a two-way street, and it's hard to know which side's efforts have been more. Are they equal? Is one doing more than the other? And I would just say it probably ebbs and flows. It probably depends on the technology type and what's going on domestically and overseas. And so with that in mind, if we narrow in and look at MCF in the space sector, we actually see a really different story. For national security dominant industries like space, they've always had deep integration. They don't need to work for more integration in the space sector. And that hasn't always been a happy marriage. One of the things that happened during the Cultural Revolution in China's first satellite, that satellite was initially a Chinese Academy of Sciences project. And they were working by themselves because the military was focused on, we've all heard, maybe you haven't heard, but you will eventually hear 2 bombs, 1 satellite.
Yeah.
Sort of like the space legacy. So
Atomic bomb,
the military
hydrogen
was
bomb,
working on 2 bombs.
Yeah.
Yeah. The military was working on its nuclear bomb and its ICBM. And the Chinese Academy of Science was working on the satellite. But during the Cultural Revolution, academics were the target. And so the CAS asked the party, can you please put us under military protection? And so that's why that legacy of deep integration is there, in addition to the fact that it's a national security related industry, and it would have been some sort of version of that anyways. And so that legacy means that it is deeply integrated, but it hasn't always been a happy marriage. Even when the Chinese national program expanded into the lunar program and the Earth observation program, through interviews and biographies that are written by the people who participated in those programs, many of the non-military scientists say that they still yearn for support for basic research and more incentives to be innovative. A recent interview of a scientist discussed his role in supporting the 2014 document that some of us have heard about that encouraged private finance into strategic industries in China, one of which was the space sector. And so the scientists played their role through probably the National People's Congress or something like that to support that initiative, because many of them felt stagnant even within state-owned enterprises. And so when we talk about China's commercial space sector, it's interesting because it's populated by a group of many different types of people.
Yeah.
You have who we fear, who are the military people using commercial space cover to get whatever they can get and take it back to the military. But you also have a bunch of other people, to include people who, were a non-military scientist or researcher working for the military, who push for this document so they would have an opportunity to do something else. You have people who retired from the military and are ready to be entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
And then you have all these private financiers who maybe use people that were already in the space sector, but they also went and poached a bunch of other types of engineers and computer scientists and then put them on a space problem. And so there's people who are just trying to make money. There are people who want to support the military. There's people who are kind of in that mixed incentive area. And it's a very interesting place to keep an eye on. And from the party's perspective, they approved private finance into the space sector so that the state-owned defense contractors would feel more pressure to become efficient and more competitive. And the Chinese Communist Party does that. They've done that through history. They'll let private finance into a sector to, make the SOEs compete.
Right.
And so that's just, they just did it in the space sector now. And so it's MCF right now is more about creating that distance and then allowing there to be a civilian space. But it, of course, always ebbs and flows. You never know when, from the party's perspective, it won't be as beneficial for there to be a separateness. And there's not a complete separateness. That's not what I'm saying. But the party wants the SOEs to be competitive. The party wants to make sure that people are more innovative, because with the second largest population in the world, they have a sharply decreasing working age population. And so they need innovation. They need people to be efficient. And so the goals that the party is trying to achieve by having private finance into the space sector are not solely focused on, I need to make the PLA competitive.
No, thank you for breaking that down for us. And just as I was listening to you, I think most of our audience will recognize corollaries in our own system as well, as we struggle to bring Silicon Valley style innovation into the defense acquisition community, and all sorts of different mindsets kind of collide there, right?
Yeah.
Sounds like that's not a uniquely American experience. I think, with perhaps the exception of the military protecting the scientists during the Cultural Revolution, each and every one of those aspects of military civil fusion are something we can recognize in our own system as well.
And that's part of the reason why this is a problem that we can crack. Like we know what they're struggling with because we've struggled with that. Does the government always get what it wants from defense contractors in the United States? Highly likely the answer is
sometimes not, right?
So it's sort of, it's different, but it's also something we can understand. And if so there's meat to work with there in terms of having a really good solution to our problem. Definitely.
Well, you mentioned a couple of ways that the PRC sets policies that aren't necessarily centric to the People's Liberation Army, right? So not really military focused, but as you mentioned, large population, trying to control an economy of that scale has got to be daunting, if even possible. Can you give us a high level of understanding of how the Chinese Communist Party views space, and how does it establish and execute policy and guidance to rapidly advance its space capabilities?
Well, it's a big question. And so I think I'll start with, the CCP's views of space, and then maybe talk a little bit about how it sets its policies. So to reiterate, the party decides in everything in China. Yeah. There's a bottom-up process that feeds into the ideas that they get to decide on. But ultimately what the party decides is what happens. And their goals are paramount. And their goals are maintain domestic stability and to maintain one-party rule. And everything else is balanced against that. So when it's beneficial for domestic stability to make sure the economy is doing really well, they might tell the PLA to, relax a little bit. Or when it's, more beneficial for the party to feel like it can maintain its one-party rule, they might feel like they can achieve that goal better through strengthening, the military's connection with the party. So it's always balanced against the party's two priorities. And so you might be surprised to hear that the space program actually achieves more of the party's domestic economic and international influence goals than it achieves the party's goals for the military. Of course, the party wants to have a strong military, but when the party thinks about its military goals, it's about information, which is bigger than space. If China could achieve its goals with Taiwan without fear of US intervention, counter space technologies would probably be less important to the PLA. They would still want, global ISR, navigation, and SATCOM, and all the bells and whistles that space brings to advanced weaponry. But in terms of focusing on counter space to be prepared to achieve their historical goal, which is to reunite with Taiwan, counter space will probably be less of a focus for them. Looking at what space does directly for the party's economic goals, like we discussed, the working age population is shrinking, they need to be innovative and efficient, and space is consistently on technology plans in China intended to fuel the economy. Incentivizing innovation in a planned economy is really hard. Yeah. It's like those mixed incentives. Let me control you, but go and do what you need to do to be innovative.
I figure out a better way to do it.
Like, it's really hard to manage that. And but space still gets them excited. It still sparks people's curiosity worldwide and in China. So it kind of does that naturally for China. And the party is aware of that. And so the thing I'd say about policymaking in China is that plans mean more than policies in China. So the 5-year plan, or there's often 15-year technology and social economic goal plans that cover 3 5-year plans. Those are all made to ensure the consistency and execution towards big goals, like exceeding or matching the US in key space technologies by 2045, or achieving a strong army by 2027. And important to note, when leadership changes in China, it's scheduled after the start of a 5-year plan. And so Chinese leaders don't come in and get to roll up their sleeves and make a new plan. It's like, no, those kinds of designs and the big goals are set, and all the incremental steps to get to the goal that everybody agreed on are already set. And it's just a matter of scratching away at the problem. We're currently in the 14th 5-year plan period, and the 14th plan started in 2021 and goes to 2025. And there's also a new 15-year plan, which started in 2021 and goes to 2035. And then there's also a space-specific plan that is published in English, which is nice. What these documents all say about space, so the space plan obviously has lots of information about space, but when you look at what in that specific document made its way into the higher level documents, what we see is deep integration of space data into the economy. That made it into the 14th 5-year plan, specifically looking at Beidou and the transportation sector. Another thing that made it into the high-level plans are improved usage of data relay satellites. So they call it space-based TT&C. Right. So that is interesting because, that made it all the way up to like the national government. Like, that's the national plan, and they still have this space makes it in there. So it's important. And in this example, it's about economic goals. And it's dual use, right? Better data relay is going to help, definitely help the military. And this approach to planning goals is useful for them. It's how they can achieve their goals without changing course. For example, we know that China's first global first in space was the Chang'e 4 lunar farside mission. And that was announced, the Chinese announced that mission in 2015, and it landed in 2019. And we're soon going to see the Chang'e 6 mission, which is going to do a farside sample return. Now, the plan to land on the far side, do radio astronomy, and return a sample was in two of the U.S. National Academy's decadal surveys in the early 2000s.
Right.
So our scientists put this idea forward. They try to justify it. They try to get funding for it. And we prioritize other equally important things over that. And the Chinese, they saw that and they're like, okay, well, we'll do that.
Right.
And so since the early 2000s, they put it in the plan all the way up to 2015. They successfully landed, the Chang'e 3, and they used the backup for Chang'e 3 to do something more innovative. And they looked at the ideas they had for innovative space things, and there was, lunar farside. And so that the planning process, that's how they achieve these long-term goals. Another type of long-term goal that an idea came from us and we sort of had other priorities and now they stuck to it and it's coming to fruition is in regards to on-orbit servicing. So, at least my understanding of what I've read from some of the older policy documents is that we used to call something called operationally responsive space, which is now assured access to space. I think I would to be, more informed about this topic. But in operationally responsive space, it included not just the quick response launch, which we focused on to this day. It also included on-orbit servicing to support responsive space capabilities. And so when we started talking about that in the early 2000s, the Chinese PLA saw that and they started thinking, oh, well, if they're going to do that, we should be prepared for that. We should do that too. And so they kind of carried on their way. And even though we at some point decided, no, that's not going to be the most efficient and high priority thing for us at this time, that's that their plans are coming to the forefront where we see SWT and several other LEO-based experiments.
Right, and I think on the U.S. Space Force side, now we're talking in terms of, you mentioned operationally responsive space, right? The ability to maneuver and be able to adjust orbits while in space, which drives a whole level of servicing that I think is climbing the priority ladder for U.S. Space Force, certainly. So great, thank you for breaking that down for us, Kristen. Let's talk a little bit more about the on-orbit servicing. So you've written a fair amount on the technology development leading up to the SWT, an experimental satellite that China launched. I think it was in 2021, 22, somewhere in there. And you framed it as on-orbit servicing, right? So maybe some folks for those, and I think you're going to recap the mission. It was very interesting, and there's been quite a bit written about it. You noted how U.S. has discussed responsive space in the past, which also included on-orbit servicing. I'd like to talk about some of the trends that you're seeing in China's space sector. But let's start by defining our terms. When you say on-orbit servicing, what are you talking about?
Well, thank you for referencing the SWT paper, which I wrote before it removed the defunct Beidou satellite from GEO. So it's a good resource for people looking for a background on China's SWT and other satellites that have robotic arms and on-orbit servicing capabilities. In that paper, I used the acronym OSAM, which is a term that has been used by NASA and the Institute for Defense Analysis. It stands for on-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. And on-orbit servicing usually includes 6 subcategories to include remote survey, relocation, refueling, repair, replacement of parts, and recharge. The Chinese also use OSAM, or on-orbit servicing. Like, it's a direct translation. They're talking about on-orbit, not with this new term that we see coming out of, like, there's a national strategy called ISAM, which is the same thing. It's just less space wonky. On orbit, your uncle at Thanksgiving might not know what that means, but if you said, oh, in space, he'd say, oh, in space, okay. So ISAM and OSAM are the same thing. The Chinese term is more like OSAM. And the other thing that if you're not a total on-orbit servicing geek like myself, you may not know that there are two U.S. consortia that are, groups of industry and government and academic groups working towards standards and best practices for on-orbit servicing. One's called, the acronym is CONFERS, and then there's a new one I just found out is called a COSMIC. So if you're interested, feel free to Google those. And you asked, if the CCP has established goals for the sector, or who the leading players are. And China has known it would need on-orbit refueling and robotics, like robotic arms, to help build its space station since the late 70s, when the ISS first deployed the Canada arm and the former Soviet Union first refueled the ISS. With that in mind, the first references to on-orbit servicing related to the Chinese space station you can see those very, very early on. But around 2016, you start to see them in reference to satellites serving other satellite functions, separate from the Chinese space station. And what I talk about in that SJ21 paper is the kind of iterative process that they went through. They built all this stuff for the Chinese space station, and then it was like, well, now we can do that. What should we do with it? And how they moved on to other things. So to have on-orbit servicing specifically mentioned around 2016, and now we know what a 5-year plan is. We have 2 national plans in China talking about on-orbit servicing. And that's really important because it provides a good illustration of how the proof of concept that China demonstrated with the first satellite to have a robotic arm, which was in LEO, so the Shenzhou-7 or the SY-7, which in 2013 was launched with a robotic arm. And that LEO demonstration, what kind of supported them putting it into the national plan, so more funding and research would go towards that initiative. And then we see in 2016, SJ17 is launched with a robotic arm, and they build off of LEO, and this time they go into GEO. And so the robotic arms are something that we've seen a fair amount of buildup on. The thing we haven't seen a lot on is, in 2016, the PLA National Defense University did its first satellite-based test of on-orbit refueling. They obviously used that to support their refueling the Chinese space station, but we haven't seen or heard about an example of them doing that in GEO. However, the Shanghai Academy of Spaceflight Technology, which is known as SAST, since 2018, they've had on their website that they have what they call a mission extension vehicle, conveniently, that they have some sort of vehicle that's capable of refueling other satellites pre-positioned in GEO. So they've had that on their website since 2018. I haven't heard of examples of that, but if we're not looking for that, do we even know what that looks like? So it's kind of like, maybe it's true, maybe it happened. we don't know. It could also just be an attempt to look like MEV. Who knows? So those are examples of existing technologies, which we should expect much more of. There's, like I said, the current space white paper, the section it has in the 14th 5-year plan on on-orbit servicing is about 3 times as large as what it was in the plan that preceded it. So there's a lot in there for different types of technologies that they want to test, as well as a couple of bullet points dedicated to how they want to engage with the international community on the topic. And again, that's published in English. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. With that in mind, the key players are currently in the PLA. The PLA is not just setting the requirements for defense contractors like SAST, but it seems a specific unit is also designing simulators to begin training PLA personnel who will operate the on-orbit servicing equipment for military space logistics missions. This to me indicates that they are getting ready to operate systems with training and doctrine at the same time that they're developing and testing those technologies. And, Chinese commercial companies are getting more access to the on-orbit servicing market. We saw that commercial companies can apply to resupply the Chinese space station. That happened last year.
Western
And
Corollaries there as well, right?
right. And something you probably haven't heard about is one of the first commercially funded experiments to use a robotic arm and a new satellite-to-satellite docking port was planned for 2021, but it failed on an iSpace launch, a Chinese iSpace launch in 2021. So they plan to do a satellite serving mission where they test their docking port, they take off a sub-satellite, do something to it, and then connect it back, and then re-enter the orbit, a part of which would survive, and they would have some probiotic tests that they would have done. I didn't have much information on that particular part of the test, but it failed. So it never happened. We didn't hear about it, but it could have happened almost 3 years ago.
Right.
So knowing that kind of shifts our perspective. Like, if that had happened, how would we be viewing what's going on now? Is something that I think about. And so it's important to note that we should expect more of those kinds of commercial and academic on-orbit servicing experiments, because I looked into provincial level and city level 5-year plans, because there's national plan,
Right.
and then all of the different ministries make their own plan, and then the localities make plans. So there's lots of plans, lots and lots of plans. And I found that a couple of provinces and cities have specific on-orbit servicing goals for their locality. So we should expect to see more academic and commercial activity in that space.
Well, thank you for that explanation of not only on-orbit servicing, but it seems like it's growing in importance, both at local and national levels, and there's a finer level of detail being applied to those activities. And I think in your recent counterspace paper, you found some examples of PLA units actually working pretty intensely on scheduling on-orbit servicing missions. Space Systems Command, the space access, mobility, and logistics responsibilities in the U.S. include on-orbit servicing and refueling, according to recently published Space Force doctrine. Is there anything you'd flag for anybody in the Space Force working in developing and operating on-orbit logistics capabilities as it compares to what China's doing?
Well, thank you for that opportunity, Greg. I would say, based off of the PLA's technical reports and what appears to be a recent training text that they published on orbit servicing, I get the sense that they take on-orbit logistics to be a military logistics function, just like on the ground. And they are training their operators to perform that function. I'm not sure what our plans are, but a question I think worth considering is, what are the pros and cons of a commercially provided on-orbit service like refueling and repair when it's in wartime? Do we want to at least have Space Force officers trained to operate those systems? Or does it work better for our system to do like we did with MEV, which was we used commercial mission control centers? I don't know the right answer, but it's just something to consider the pros and cons. In the space sector, the PLA works out what it wants, and then it asks defense contractors to meet or exceed. This lets them get the ball rolling on PLA training for its operators to perform in-orbit logistics, and it also inserts PLA planned operations into the thinking about international norms. There are, as you know, international discussions on norms related to active debris removal, norm discussions related to translating international laws of armed conflict into space. And I don't know for sure, but I imagine that if the PLA knows what it needs regarding on-orbit servicing, and it can share that with its diplomats earlier than we can share with our diplomats what we want, that could be a disadvantage for us.
Speaking of geosatellites, there's a question, I've been wanting to ask you this question for a couple of years now. Can you leave us some of your thoughts on the SJ-17 and the SJ-21 missions? And how do you put these in context? Are they precursors to other Chinese missions that may be coming up in the future?
Well, the first thing I always try to remind people about SJ-17 and SJ-21 is that at the time of launch, Chinese state media said that SJ-17 would carry out several experiments, including debris observation. At the time of launch of SJ-21, Chinese state media also said the primary function will be testing debris mitigation technology. And those satellites have done just that. They may have additional functions, but they have done at the very least what they said that they would do. I think that these satellites are advancements of technology that was demonstrated in LEO, and such as the SY-7 with the robotic arm we discussed, and SJ-15 as the close approach technologies. Additionally, some have speculated in the US and in China that SJ-21 tested a space tether. And if that's true, it wouldn't be too surprising because according to the university that designed the Aolong-1, which was a LEO satellite that tested a robotic arm, their university website about that satellite says they also tested not just a robotic arm, but also a space tether. And so with what we see about China building, demoing technology in LEO that they then also develop for GEO, I wouldn't be surprised if SJ-21 did it actually, also test a space tether.
Right.
But I don't know. The one thing we haven't seen is like what we were talking about in terms of SAST and its refueler in GEO. So are they precursors, or I would also suggest maybe they're extras. Something that we see in the Chinese lunar program is that they will build a backup satellite for big missions. So Chang'e-1 was the first lunar orbiter. So then after they succeeded with that mission, Chang'e-2 is what they launched to go to Sun-Earth L2, and then also did an asteroid flyby. Chang'e-4 is the backup for Chang'e-3. So it might be that these satellites are backups from something else, or it could be that they are precursors to other large on-orbit servicing capabilities, or something that I discuss in the Counterspace report is that I would argue that once satellite-based robotic arms are miniaturized, and we know that the PLA is interested in miniaturization and nanosatellites specifically for weapons capability, in addition to other capabilities, but they talk about nanosatellites a lot as a weapon. If they're able to miniaturize those technologies, then it would more likely be potentially a precursor for a counter space capability. One of the last things I'll say about SJ-17, and towards our earlier discussion about unclassified information and about deterring China through attributing bad behavior, is that in the 2018 and 2020 time period, SJ-17 approached several foreign satellites to include a less than 10-kilometer approach to a Russian and separately an Indian satellite. And we didn't hear about it in the US media. And we also didn't at least hear the Russians were upset or the Indians were upset. Maybe they didn't know, or maybe they didn't care, or another possibility is, while it may have been somebody's RPO, it could have been somebody else's transit. So maybe it wasn't something that was confronting to somebody.
Right.
And so the point is just that we should capitalize on the opportunity to more consistently publicize what's going on in space as a public service and as a commitment to information transparency. And talking about, attributing behavior, whether or not it's bad or not, but just being more transparent about that is not going to necessarily reveal sources and methods, which is what I think many people worry about. Much of the available information that's publicly available through spacetrack.org can tell very interesting stories if we just go and look at it. So that's one of the things I hope to spend more time on. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you for that great explanation. This has been a great discussion. We need to wrap it up here. Congratulations on your recent work. We kind of described where people can find some of the things that you've done. Are there other CASI resources out there that that you'd like to point out for guardians they may find beneficial?
You know, the website has what we write and what we translate. And in regards to what we've translated and made available, include what's called the Lectures on the Science of Space Operations, which is the PLA's training manual for its space operators. It's from 2013, but it is still absolutely relevant. And there may be, it says volume 2 on the cover of the one we translated, so I would only guess that there's going to be another update, but they build on existing information. And so it's in English, it's what they're telling their space operators. There's a huge section on US military space history, which taught me more about our military space history than I'd ever known. So that is at least worth reading. And so the CASI website has our research as well as our translations, and those are there for your support.
Fantastic. Thank you again for spending some time with the Space Force Association. We really appreciate it, and have a great day. And thank you for all you do for the community and helping us to better understand what the Department of Defense calls our pacing threat.
Thank you. Happy to help.